So thank you very much for joining us today. I'll start by introducing our speaker, Dr. Warren Mansell. Dr. Mansell is a reader in clinical psychology at the University of Manchester. He's the author of over 200 peer-reviewed publications, including the Interdisciplinary Handbook of Perceptual Control Theory. And this talk is going to begin with the fundamental role of a unifying theory underpinning classification in science. It provides the compelling evidence for such an approach to psychiatry and takes it to its natural conclusion, which is a community-wide style of talking to another person about a problem that leads to self-led discovery through a trial and error process, akin to evolution by natural selection. We've posted some links below, and I will add those links into the YouTube channel as well. I suppose it's just to say, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Mansell. When I was I intercaled in psychology when I was a medical student in 2013-14, I think, and it was your lectures on perceptual control theory that just really I found it fascinating, particularly your appeal to kind of modeling these kinds of theories and actually testing predictions. So I'm really looking forward to hearing you speak today. So I'll let you take it away.
Okay, super. Thanks, Chris, for asking me, and thanks for all of you for coming along. What I might do is leap into explaining PCT, because I think we can I can cover a lot of area if I wanted to, but I think it's most important that we can use this time to for me to explain what this theory is, and also to point you to a number of areas for wider reading if you are interested in what the theory has to say. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen.
That's great, we can see that.
Okay, you can see that. So I want to explain the theory, and I want to do it in quite a gradual way by explaining some core principles: control, conflict, levels, and reorganization. I want to say a few things first, though. Just as Chris said, I have edited a handbook of perceptual control theory, and it's in here where you could read more about the interdisciplinary applications of the theory. It's a very unique theory in terms of how broadly it applies across disciplines. And I think there's something in that in terms of these core principles being quite fundamental to how living systems work. And again, I can be drawn on some of these areas when we come to questions, if you like. And one of the areas, which I'm not going to talk about in detail today, but Chris alluded to there, is the extent to which this theory can be tested actively with robotic devices. And in the last few years, there's really been an explosion of papers published showing how the theory can reproduce various forms of control in a way that's quite similar to living organisms and quite parsimonious in the architecture. Again, I can be drawn on this later, but I just wanted to touch base on this area so that you can see this is one feature of PCT. And the other aspect is to point you to the different directions we can go with this. Sometimes I'll give a talk that's more around the neuroscience and the motor control. Sometimes I take more of an evolutionary approach, and sometimes I take a much more practical, therapeutic and clinical approach. I'm going to touch on all of these, and again, when it comes to questions, we can be drawn on aspects, but there are key review papers across these different perspectives on PCT. But I think what's important, like I say, to just explain the theory. And at the heart, it's very simple. It's a psychological form of homeostasis, okay? So we all understand what homeostasis is, having a background in biology and medicine. It's the way that our body entails that we remain, our bodies and our cells remain in a survivable range of physiological variables. So our body temperature, our blood glucose levels, our kind of ATP levels, our salt ion concentrations, all of these physiological variables are being kept and maintained within a range that allows us to survive and prosper. And it's uncontroversial that is going on, largely driven by the brainstem, and throughout our bloodstream, these hormones are signaling to keep homeostasis going. And it's also going on within a more local environment, biologically speaking, as well. It's also uncontroversial that works through negative feedback control, i.e. your brain senses an error, for example, from your desired body temperature, and that error drives actions or drives processes that restore that temperature back to normal. And for example, if it was blood glucose and it was going too high, your body would naturally release insulin to restore the blood glucose to the correct range. So it's fairly uncontroversial that this process of negative feedback control is how the body works. PCT literally proposes that the same thing is going on in the higher level parts of the brain as well, but those outputs that are restoring the variables to their desired states, to their reference levels, if you like, or their set points, those outputs are going via behavior through aspects of the environment, which could be, you know, the ground that you're walking on. It could be a tool that you use. It could be a temperature dial that you're changing and adjusting, in order to keep that variable in the range that you want it to be. Okay, so it's just another form of homeostasis, but what we see as behaviors are this process of adjustment to keep the sensory inputs that we are taking in through our eyes and ears and our tactile senses, our proprioception, etc., and keeping them in the right range. So it's a bit like a Goldilocks theory of life, that we want everything in that just right range. And we'll change and we'll do whatever we need to do to keep it in that range, even if that means changing our behavior on the fly from moment to moment. Now, PCT is related to classic control engineering that goes back to the beginning of the last century at least, and it is somewhat related to a field called cybernetics, which some of you might be aware of. But it isn't the same thing because it makes some clear departures from there too. What I want to do at this point is to try and really clarify what PCT is through a very simple demonstration. In a moment, I'm going to show you a video of two hands both holding a pen. The one on the right is myself, the one on the left is a volunteer. And all I want you to do is work out what that volunteer on the left was told to do, okay? So I just need to find the right video. Can everyone see a screen with two hands over a white page?
Yeah.
Okay, so like I say, the volunteer is the person on the left. Both of us are going to leave a trail of our behavior on this page, okay? But I've given that person on the left an instruction. I've told them what to do. Is they're doing. Okay. Okay. Did everyone see that?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah. What I'd like you to do is have a think and tell me what you think the person on the left was told to do. and just unmute yourself if you want to come up with an answer, providing you've not seen this before, of course. Anybody want to hazard a guess what they were told to do? Chris has seen it, I'm
I'm
sure.
keeping quiet, yeah.
Yeah.
It looks as though when you went in one direction, the other hand was trying to pull you back to the middle, as it were. So if you pulled away, they pulled away. If you went towards the center, they seemed to do that too.
Yeah.
So I don't know quite how you put that.
So it's possible that they were being told. Yeah, it's possible they were being told to do the opposite of what I was doing, or to pull against. Yeah, and that is quite a common answer. Unfortunately, it's not the correct answer. But thanks for offering one.
I'll go back to mute then.
Any other ideas? Any other ideas about what it might be?
So did you say to mimic your action? As in, did you ask the person to
we've not covered that, but to mimic or to mirror or to copy what I was doing is another very common answer to this. Unfortunately, it's not true either. It wasn't to mimic or copy what I was doing, even though that did happen, as did the doing the opposite happen, but it wasn't what they were told to do. Wasn't what they thought they were doing. Okay, if there's no more suggestions, then I'll give you the answer, and then I'll show you the video again. The answer is that they were told to keep the knot in the middle of the rubber band always immediately above the dot on the page. Okay, so I will show you this now, if I can find the... Yeah, there it is. So have a look at that now. Can you see that the knot keeps very near to the dot? And obviously, if one person pulls it away, the other one's going to have to do the opposite to keep the knot over the dot. And during this whole process, it ends up that they almost produce a mirror image of the behavior on the page. But neither of those things are actually what they were told to do. Okay. Does anybody want to make a suggestion as to why I've given you this demo to try and explain the theory and to try and get a new perspective on behavior? If not, I can roll on with it. Okay. What I'll do is I'll share with you because we ran this study for a group of participants. We actually ran it several times. You know, you definitely weren't alone in not working it out. Only 1% of people worked out what that instruction was. We even did it where we asked people to concentrate on the rubber bands and the knots on the rubber bands, and still only a small proportion of people worked out what it was. Okay. So what this illustrates is that very often we can't work out what someone is doing just by looking at their behavior. Even if we've got a very accurate record of their behavior, like you saw from you know, that trail that was kept on that was drawn out on the piece of paper. Okay, and actually a lot of the behavior that you saw was emerged from what the client was really doing. They were keeping a knot over the dots, but in order to do that, they need to do things like pull against the other person, and they ended up mirroring them and drawing a picture. Some people even thought they were being told to draw a picture of a kangaroo or a map of Crete or something. Okay, and the idea of this demonstration is to suggest that that's what all behavior is. All behavior is an attempt to keep some kind of perception the way you want it to be. So in this example, it was to keep the knot over the dot. Okay, that's what you're concentrating on, that's what you're doing. But how you do that varies in the here and now, and it needs to act against disturbances, things that are going to push it off target in order to keep that going. And sometimes when you see people's behavior, you can interpret it and think, oh, that's what they were doing, that's what they wanted to do. When actually their behavior is something that they've not even planned or learned. It's something that they're doing just to keep a knot over a dot. So for example, let's take this to a clinical sphere and think of someone who has the rule, I must never feel anxious. Okay, that's their knot over the dot. As soon as they feel a little bit of anxiety, they have to bring it back down to 0 again. Okay, that person will do whatever they need to do in that environment to keep their anxiety at 0. Whether that means leaving the room, avoiding eye contact, changing the subject, tensing their body up, going home and drinking, you know, whatever, okay? But what's consistent in all that is it's the same goal, to keep that anxiety at a specific point. It might be that the person's goal is to try and never re-experience a trauma and try and tell themselves it never happened. It might be to always be the most important person in the room, etc. Okay, so the idea is that we can understand people's psychology in a much simpler way by identifying what their controlled variables are, what their knots over dots are, rather than trying to develop some quite complex categorization of their observable behavior. Because according to this theory, their observable behavior just emerges in the moment to implement this control of their sensory experience, of their perception. And actually, if you do this study and you suddenly pull at the rubber band, you get probably a 200 millisecond delay and the other person pulls back, okay? That looks like a reaction time between a stimulus and a response. So it looks like the stimulus and response are tied together in some way. But actually, that's just a speeding up of exactly the same process. So actually what we see as stimulus-response connections are arguably an artifact of creating a sudden, unpredictable disturbance that the person needs to suddenly correct. And so that kind of calls into question really how we understand the nature of behavior and how we understand learning, with the idea that we don't learn specific behaviors, we learn new things to control, and that's how we develop as human beings. And so I'll return back to that because we can talk more about the complexities of it. Okay, so that's control. Like I say, or more elaborately, control is about achieving and maintaining a variable at a desired value through action that counteracts the effects of disturbances to that variable. It's like having knots over dots for everything. It's the just right Goldilocks process. It's what we do when we're social distancing, you know, trying to keep that right distance from the other person. It's what we do sometimes when some people try and control anxiety, but also you can control quite abstract variables like your sense of justice, and you can live your life, for example, to try and keep everything, you know, according to the law, for example. So the idea is that we have these many different variables we're controlling, some of which are very concrete, like the knot over the dot, but they're organized in levels of abstraction, which we'll come to in a minute. But what I want to talk about with you next is conflict. And conflict is when you control a variable at 2 or more different values. Classically in the knot and the dot, and I won't do this live, but there's one way of doing this where one person controls to keep the knot over one dot, and the other person controls to try and keep it over the other dot. So as soon as it goes away from one person, the other person tries to bring it back. What happens, as you might imagine, is they escalate their attempts at pulling this rubber band until the rubber band breaks. Okay, so conflict undermines the ability to control things, and so conflict is a really important principle to understand. And we can think about it in everyday examples, and here's a couple of clinical examples. So like I said earlier, I've worked in the past helping people with the diagnosis of bipolar disorder. For many people with this background, part of them wants to be really excited, creative, but they're also very terrified of going into those states because they can end up in a manic episode. So they actually also want to be calm and measured and logical. And so they're in conflict about how kind of activated they want their thoughts and feelings to be. But even something as simple as a phobia, somebody comes for treatment for a phobia because they want to get better. They want to actually be able to face their fear. Maybe because in the spider example, they want to go camping, or they want to show that they're strong to their family, for example. So they've got a goal to get closer to the spider, but of course they've also got a goal to get further away because they're terrified. They think they might be bitten, they might have a panic attack, etc. And so from a PCT perspective, we understand the loss of control very often as a case of conflict. And it's a bit more sophisticated than the idea that some stimulus, like a spider, either triggers avoidance or triggers approach, which is the sort of standard behavioural perspective. Like I was saying just then, what it's actually proposing is we have two control systems, one that wants to get closer in this example, and one that wants to get further away. And they're both vying to kind of use our behavior to get their desired distance. And that can feel very confusing and difficult for someone who's in conflict because they're oscillating between approach and avoidance and not really finding a stable state, feeling quite confused and uncertain. And
Sorry,
this is something that we can...
Warren, my apologies. David, it's saying that we've only got 9 minutes left on the Zoom call.
You can restart calls from the same Zoom
Yes,
ID.
I'm so sorry about that. We've never had that problem before because it's always given me a indefinite amount of time. But I wonder if they've changed their thing. We might have to drop out and drop back in again, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that's fine. You just have to.
I'm really sorry about that. It's never happened before.
That's all right. Here's the one of the studies that we did looking at this. So we were looking as to whether when, and we know that exposure therapy is a very recognized therapy for treating phobias. It's often assumed that exposure is managed by the therapist, and the therapist structures the process and maybe encourages the client to face their fears. But what happens if you get people who are fearful of something like a spider, and you don't tell them that they need to expose themselves to this image, you just leave it up to them, but you vary or you manipulate how much control they actually have over their distance from the thing they're afraid of. So this is a task where they had a spider moving towards and away from them on a computer screen in a virtual corridor, and then they could impose their control over that. Half of the participants had effective control and half of them didn't, but both of them were told that they would be able to control their distance from the spider. What happens when you look at the impact of exposure? What we found was that it was only the people who controlled their own exposure that benefited from it and got closer to the spider after doing this task. And this was the case even 2 weeks later, when we followed them up and asked about how much they were avoiding spiders, with the people who had not been in control of their exposure actually kind of falling back in terms of their progress in terms of avoidance. So here's a kind of a clinical example of how control may be critical, and how actually what we maybe should be doing is help people just resolve the conflicts that they're going through, rather than feeling like we need to, as a clinician, take them through a process. This is a more technical diagram of what I would propose is going on in that scenario. So you have a control system which is saying you need to face your fears, and that's setting a reference point I've called R1 here for a close distance to the spider. Okay, and then over here we have another control system, another goal. This one's saying stay safe, which is setting a further distance from the spider. But those reference points are going into the same lower level system that is going to use behavior to control distance, and that's where the conflict lies. So somehow we need a way of managing that conflict, and what it's proposed in the theory is that we need to help the client to go to a higher level system where they can manage this conflict. Now, for example, when this happens clinically, the therapist and the client actually have a long conversation about this process and the model, and they might work on a graded hierarchy together, where conversations are happening about wanting to face your fears, but also wanting to something terrible not to happen. And it's proposed that during that conversation, this higher level system is developing. For one person, it might be they conceptualize that as being brave, you know, facing fear and doing it anyway. But other people might have other ways of being able to manage these kind of conflicting goals. And this system then needs to be developed, and it needs to be organized and reorganized to most effectively restore control. And it's at a higher level in the person's network, if you like. Ah, I see you've managed to upgrade dynamically. That was very clever. Well done, David. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about hierarchies. You know, in real life, if we think of this at a neural level, there is a very complex network of these systems connected to achieve the kind of sophisticated skills that we manage, multiple levels and multiple parallel systems. Okay, this is a kind of a functional kind of idea. Actually, what you probably expect is it to be a branch network, with there being multiple systems at low levels, and as you go higher, you start to get a more consolidated, smaller number of high-level goals, like, you know, to be a brave person, to be myself, to maintain my self-worth, etc. So it's proposed, according to theory, that we organize these control units in a hierarchy, and that's how we manage our experiences. Unfortunately, there's a research group led by Henry Yin over at Duke University that have been working on this from the neuroscience perspective for the last 5 or 10 years. And they've been working in animal studies where they've used a novel form of methodology that shows this process of perceptual control in action. So instead of restricting an animal's movement and presenting it with kind of fixed stimuli and looking at brain responses, they let the animal, normally a mouse or a rat, roam free, but because it's connected to the electrical measures, they can explore the relationship between the neural firing and the dynamic changes, the kinematics of movement, as they're happening naturally under the volition of the animal itself. So it's this very naturalistic behavior. And what you find when you do this is a really tight correlation between neural firing in certain specific areas of the basal ganglia and certain specific kinematic measures. So for example, the velocity of movement correlates very tightly within individual animals with, I think it's neural firing in the striatum. But Henry and his team have done a whole range of these studies to try and plot out the hierarchy. And this is Henry's kind of
Warren,
current...
I can't see, have you changed slides since the hierarchy of the spider one?
Oh.
It
yes,
looks
I
like,
have.
I don't know about other people,
All right, let me stop sharing and reshare it again. Sorry about that. Well, that's about. Let me just try it again. I do have something funny on my screen, like it's cutting it. Is there a branching hierarchy now? Is it
No, so it's gone. It's that hierarchy that you showed before, but rather than being in the kind of presentation mode, it's as if it's one slide on a PowerPoint, and we can see it from how it would look when you're not in presenting mode.
All right, let's try. Let me just try sharing my desktop and seeing if that works. What can you see now?
Yeah, so we can see, yes, that's it. Yes, so I can see what looks almost like a neural network.
Sorry about that. Okay, so let's go back. So this was the spider example, where we've kind of brought out some key control systems. This is how they're embedded within a larger network. Yeah? Does that come through?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then this is most likely what it looks like from a more three-dimensional point of view, with this kind of root and branch system, with the high level, there being less high level systems than there are lower level systems. Yeah. Is that there on the screen? Yeah.
Yeah, we're all good now. Yeah, thank you.
Great. And then this is Henry Yin's model, hierarchical model, that brings in some of the brain regions and specifies some of the specific control variables in certain brain regions. Okay. Yeah. So this hierarchy is useful both from a kind of neural modeling point of view, but also from a clinical point of view. Just like I was saying before, when there's conflict, you need to help the process of change happen at the level above the conflict. And we would argue that happens when a person is able to code what their perceptual experiences are in language, put it into words, write about it, talk about it, and sustain it in awareness as they're talking about it. And it's proposed that this learning process of reorganization happens at those points that we are currently aware of and that we're currently putting into words, if you like. So reorganization is the learning process, according to the theory. It's not about learning specific actions, but it is a trial and error process. But what's happening is there's a trial and error process whereby the components of that control system are created. So these functions, for example, that identify aspects of the environment, like your distance from something or the color of an object, these functions are constructed by reorganization. And then what we call the gains of the control system, which are, for example, the error sensitivities of these control systems, are adjusted through reorganization. None of this translates directly to behavior, because how behavior is going to unfold is going to depend on what's going on in the environment. But the systems that interface with that environment are being changed by reorganization. And like I was saying, the idea is that approximates to where the spotlight of our conscious awareness is. And so through helping people to keep experiences in their awareness, you facilitate reorganization. And that's arguably, for example, why exposure works, why it helps to keep those difficult experiences and emotions within the spotlight of awareness. Because the longer it stays there, the longer reorganization through this trial and error process, akin to a natural selection process, is able to stumble upon a novel set of parameters that reestablishes control. And so all we need to do to help people is to get people's attention to those places that are at the root of their conflict and keep it there. Now, there are computer models of reorganization, which I won't show today. It's quite difficult to test experimentally, but you can see these models working that we can discuss if you're interested. What I want to just turn to now is just a sample of the kinds of very practical now interventions that we base on this theory. Method of levels is the one-to-one psychotherapy that's based on the theory. It was actually conceived of back in the 1950s when the theory was being developed. But during the 1990s was when it was transformed into a mental health intervention. And we've got 4 therapy manuals now published on method of levels. We've got something called the Take Control course, which is a 6-week session that helps people really understand these principles of control and conflict and the different levels of a problem. That's targeted largely to people with common mental health problems like anxiety and depression. We also have an artificial intelligence therapist called Milo, which emulates method of levels, but through a text-based conversation. And then we also have what we call the 4 Ds of dealing with distress, which is a one-off, ultra-brief workplace stress intervention that doesn't educate people in the theory, but it uses the theory to ground and build upon the coping strategies they already have at sort of different levels of control that they can re-establish. So we reconceptualize, for example, applied relaxation as a short-term control strategy and aspects like expressive writing as a long-term control strategy. And we help people draw on some really obvious everyday experiences to kind of to grasp that kind of angle on things. But let me say a little bit about method levels because it's we find it very fascinating. The great thing about method levels as a therapy is that it's very simple and parsimonious. It still takes a while to train because it takes a long time to grasp this concept. But as a therapist, all you do is maintain your curiosity to ask about the problem that the client's describing. The client is in control of the session. They decide what to talk about it and how to talk about it, but you are listening attentively throughout this and asking more, sometimes quite naive questions about the problem. And you're also on the lookout for background perceptions that they may not have put into words yet. They're like the kind of fleeting thoughts that a cognitive therapist would identify, or the pre-conscious processes that a psychoanalyst would identify. But we're not going to try and formulate them. We just say to people, oh, what's going on there as you just paused? Or what's that smile about? So we're giving people an opportunity to bring in background perceptions at the fringe of their consciousness into the foreground description of their problem. Other than that, as a therapist, you keep out the way. So you're very active, but you're scaffolding what the client is doing. And ideally, you provide this in a fully open-ended, iterative way, rather than for any prescriptive number of sessions or any prescriptive length of session. We've published a lot of very pragmatic trials of method levels, where there are unscreened samples in everyday settings that have shown good effect sizes, but there are very few randomized controlled trials. There's one on my ResearchGate website, which is quite a small one. There are a number of sort of financial and logistic reasons why they've not been done yet, but that is the intention. One line of research we've done is to look at the differences between method levels and other therapies. There's a audio recording online if people are interested, comparing method levels with ACT and motivational interviewing. But we've done some coding that shows that it's highly distinct and different from other therapies because of these properties that I've described. There's also some evidence emerging that it's more efficient, but for many people it can provide change in a shorter number of sessions. And we've done things, for example, in comparing its mechanism to behavior therapy, showing that after doing method levels, people's awareness goes up to their longer term goals, and after doing behavior therapy, it goes more to their specific actions. So that's really all I wanted to say to give a kind of a flavour of what PCT is and how it informs clinical work, but is also grounded in wider science. If you're interested, we can talk about things now, but there's also various Twitter threads that have got a lot of these studies as they come up and get shared. So that's really all I want to say. I want to leave it now to you guys leading the questioning and the content.
Warren, thank you so much. That was a really fascinating and interesting talk, and I think having a bit of background knowledge myself, I felt like you really captured the essence of things there. So thank you. I've got a ton of questions, but I'd like to actually, I'm going to be selfish. I'm going to start with one question. As I alluded to, a lot of your work is kind of practically tested in models, and in a previous talk that I'd given, we'd kind of discussed about the catching a fly ball example. But do you have a particularly favorite or interesting example of where you've kind of been able to model and test predictions, that you would like to share?
I mean, we could talk about the fly ball example. I mean, one that maybe goes a little bit beyond that is that we constructed a PCT controller for what's called an inverted pendulum. So it's basically a robot that keeps itself still on two wheels, keeps itself vertical. And there are lots of different solutions to that problem out there. But we compared a PCT controller to two of the most kind of contemporary and popular controllers, and the PCT controller was much more robust against disturbances. So it was much more able to right itself when it was pushed away from its goal state of being vertical. And it was a very simple architecture compared to the much more elaborate ones that it was being compared to. And I think that's because those ones were kind of presuming that the system itself needed to form a fully detailed physical model of itself and the world and predict its future actions. Whereas that's not what the PCT system was doing. It was literally trying to immediately restore its balance by sending out what was actually quite a simple signal to lower levels, but because it was regularly checking its error state, it was correcting itself on the fly very, very quickly, and maintaining that stability. So that was a nice example. I've done some worked with some students on some examples that are much more in the therapeutic domain, looking at whether where you allow a hierarchy to reorganize, how effectively that restores control to a conflicted system. We've shown in those that when reorganization or this learning process is placed above the systems in conflict, then it restores control effectively, compared to if you're just restricting the learning process to either of the two systems in conflict, which kind of makes sense if you think about it. They're both in control. So somehow you need to find a higher level system that accommodates them. Does that help?
It does, yes, thank you. And I suppose your point about the simplicity of that first example is that computationally it's using less resources, or however you want to phrase it. It's more parsimonious in terms of the explanation. Is that right?
Yeah, and what we would argue is it reflects the reality of the social and natural environment, which is that there are changes in our environments, multiple changes at multiple levels that are extremely difficult to anticipate in advance. And so you need a very kind of responsive system that uses negative feedback to dynamically kind of maintain stability. It's like, you know, I don't know if any of you had this, you're on a boat and it's a bit of a, on a boat journey and it's a bit rocky because of the weather and somehow you need to keep your beer straight. There's no way that you can predict, you know, every shift and change in that movement. What you can do though is focus your concentration on the variable that you're controlling, just like tightrope walking, for example, and keep your conscious awareness on that and allow your behavior, your lower level systems to do all those tweaks and changes dynamically that they need to do. But that is going to emerge from trying to control something that is at the focus of your attention.
I was thinking about about psychopathology and how this fits various different sorts of psychopathology, like psychosis, for example, and hallucinatory experiences. And I suppose the sort of understanding the phenomena of psychosis is an attempt to strive for stability at some level.
Yeah, I mean, so many, yeah, if we think about so many
I've lost Warren there. Has anybody else lost him?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, hopefully it'll
he's frozen.
reboot again.
Oh, there we are.
Sorry,
yeah, we lost you there.
I recognised I was freezing there, so I paused. So yeah, some of the facets of the experiences of people's psychosis, or a lot of them, seem to resonate around control, don't they? Being controlled by others, being able to control things, thought control, etc. So there is clearly a theme of control there. Yeah, I mean, when we work with clients, we use method of levels. Let's pause.
We can still hear you.
We can hear you.
Okay. We use method of levels, whatever the diagnosis and whatever the presentation. And actually, people with psychosis can find it very empowering because we're just talking about what they're going through in the here and now and helping them talk us through how they're managing to control what matters to them whilst they're experiencing these things they're experiencing. So we really kind of work within their frames of reference rather than trying to impose our own. But from a theoretical point of view, there is many points of contact there. One of them is to think about reorganization. You know, we need that creative process intrinsically in our brains, but like I was saying, it needs to be controlled and focused onto the arena that's going to make the difference to our life problems. Arguably, what's going on sometimes with people is that they're reorganizing, they're in intrinsic error, you know, they're out of kilter, but they're not focusing that change process on where the problem is and what's really underlying their difficulties. And so this system, this brain system, is churning away, trying to find a solution. But it's doing it at very low levels in the system. It's changing people's perceptions. It's changing people's immediate priorities. It's changing people's social kind of processes. And they're, rather than actually going up to, well, you know, this is actually more about the fact that I've always wanted to be, you know, an independent person, but my family have always kept me back, and yeah, etc., etc. So what you do in method levels is you start with wherever that awareness is focused, but you just let it go and let it lead itself to those higher levels, to what's behind that, and help to draw out those more long-standing, arguably more relevant themes for change, to do with need for control, to do with being connected with others, to do with being looked up to, whatever those. So you're helping people to actually talk in frames of reference where if reorganization goes there, it's going to actually help them make long-term changes. Whereas if it stays in the in a very concrete perceptual realm, it's probably just going to perpetuate the hallucinations. But it also helps people, because they're in charge, decide. Maybe they want to keep this voice, maybe they don't. Maybe they want to keep some, remove others. The point of this therapy is to put the person in charge and make that decision, because ultimately this theory has the sort of faith, if you like, that when people feel in more control of what matters to them, they're not going to need services as much.
That's interesting, isn't it? There's an interesting interplay there between what sounds like a very naturalistic model you've got to do with homeostasis, which is about control and stability of an internal environment, and social values there about being independent and self-determining and in control in that sort of sense.
Yeah.
I mean, is that a coincidence, or is?
No, it's
it just interests me. Yeah.
What I might share with you is another slide. That's quite a good one. You've got a slide there with reorganization system on the left and control hierarchy on the right. Yeah. So what I've been talking about is this hierarchy on the right, and I've proposed that it develops and starts at very low levels where you're sort of controlling your intensity of experience, but it soon goes higher where you're trying to control and manage relationships, programs and sequences of experience, right up to what the high level are your principles and your system concepts. So for example, your self-identity. So the idea is that this system on the right develops during infancy and becomes increasingly more developed over during childhood and early adulthood. How does it develop? It's constantly being reorganized by this intrinsic system. This is your truly homeostatic system that is keeping your intrinsic reference signals at the state they need to be, keeping you alive, keeping those essential physiological variables going. And if your brainstem is kind of unable to restore those to their desired states, it sends out signals to reorganize, do something different, control something in a different way. And so in order to develop as human beings, we have to find some mutual cooperation between these intrinsic systems that we're born with, that are our temperaments, that are required for learning, and all of these goals and values that we learn during our lifetime. And sometimes some of those goals themselves conflict with one another. At other times they conflict with kind of what our kind of immediate need is in that moment. And so no, it's not a coincidence that we cover both those things, because they are both part of the theory. I am actually working on the idea that some of these higher levels are in themselves potentially a third parallel system, which is purely coded in sort of propositional, linguistic, logical terms, and is separate from the perceptual hierarchy. And it wouldn't be a coincidence if you drew analogies between that and the id, the ego, and the superego, or between primary, secondary, and tertiary consciousness, because I think they're all control systems. PCT goes a long way, I would propose, in suggesting a likely organisation of those, but there is further work to be done, because there are clearly multiple intrinsic systems, and this clarity regarding what we're controlling that is very perceptual and embodied versus what we control that's quite logical and symbolic needs to be spelt out a bit more. That makes sense.
So I've got lots more questions, but I want to encourage and allow the opportunity for other folks to have their say. I'm waiting for Ajeev to bring up predictive processing and challenge you on that, but he's not taken the bait.
No, I mean,
maybe because I didn't even need to mention the word prediction.
No, I would have asked you, you know, how this links to the free energy principle or something of that sort. But you know, it's up to you whether you want to kind of do that or not. But no, it's very interesting. I'm more interested in the theoretical bit of the control itself. But one of the questions which I was kind of thinking was, where does the hierarchy kind of stop at the highest level? You know, as in, what would be the highest level of in the hierarchy? Within
I mean, PCT is two types of theory. It's a theory of fundamental principles of control within living systems or machines that emulate living systems. And to answer the question in that regards, the sky's the limit. You know, whatever living system just needs to create whatever level it needs to resolve that, you know, to create a new perceptual level that's going to manage the conflicts at the level below. So at that very meta theory fundamental level, there's, you know, like I say, the sky's the limit. For all we know, octopuses and aliens have perceptual levels. But at another level, PCT is a theory of what could be going on in the human nervous system. And Bill Powers went so far as to specifying the system concept at that top level, which is, you know, a perception of a system that is a working combination of principles, whether that be a person or an organization or a country or whatever. But he didn't try to describe what might be at the level above that. And different people have tried different ideas. Is it an ethos? Is it just the truth? You know, is it a worldview? I don't know. But, you know, there will be something, and I'm sure some human or in the future will get to that point and be able to.
It's absolutely fascinating. I need to read.
Well, maybe they are already.
So there you go. This is kind of given me a lot more to go.
Yeah. Do you want my take on free energy and predictive?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
You know, I would. Yes.
Okay. Well, there's a few angles on this, and they vary between the kind of the philosophical, the scientific, and the political. I mean, I think firstly the really strongly.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Sorry, Warren. Could we just couple of sentences? Just perhaps some people might not be familiar with predictive processing or the free energy principle.
Yeah.
Could we maybe, I don't know if yourself or Raj just wants to very, very briefly just give a flavor.
Oh, I'd rather you take you go ahead, Warren. You're the speaker. So.
Right. Well, I'd say they're not necessarily the same. They're not the same thing, but free energy is probably more interesting. And I think the real kind of exciting thing about free energy principle is that it's an attempt to understand the development of complex systems at a very, very fundamental level, going right back to the origin of life and the very first point at which a living self-organizing entity kind of separates itself from its surrounding environment. But that is a good point of contact between the two theories, because free energy proponents do also describe homeostasis and explain that how homeostasis is a core property of living systems. But I think the next step then is often to propose that there needs to be a predictive model in order to preempt the dysregulation of these homeostatic systems, which is not a million miles away from what we're saying here. There's this perceptual hierarchy that's growing to try and keep this homeostatic system in balance. In PCT terms, though, that perceptual hierarchy is not predicting, it's controlling. And that's because living things don't just perceive, process, form a model, and then sometime later emit an action to that presupposed model. Because we would argue, if you do, by the time you've constructed your action, the model's got out of date. And of course, predictive processing theories do propose that the models need to be continually updated.
Yeah.
But we would propose that you don't even need a model in the first place. What you need is to construct a function that can identify your incoming stimuli, your perceptions, and organize them so that you can try and control them and keep them in the zone that you want them to do, like with personal distance, for example. And it doesn't matter actually if that constructed signal is accurate or not. It could be completely biased, it could be egocentric, but it will be whatever it needs to be to help that person or that living thing control as effectively as possible. And because you're continually using negative feedback and you're continually testing a new action, this way, that way, this way, that way, because you're doing that so fast, you can keep that perceptual variable in the right zone, even without knowing your environment or having a model of your environment. And the classic example, like Chris was saying, is the flyball example. It's shown in computer models that baseball fielders get themselves in the right position to catch a fly ball that's coming up at them, not by modeling anything to do with the physics of the environment or even of their own bodies or actions, but merely by having constructing two variables. One is their lateral displacement from the image of the ball on their retina, and the other one is the velocity of the image of the ball on the retina. Nothing to do with the actual velocity of the ball in the real world, just the image of the ball on the retina. And if you vary your actions, back, right, left, up, forward, backwards, left, right, to keep those two variables controlled, you end up in the right place to catch the ball with absolutely no awareness or no computation of any actions or physical environments or bodily systems to get there. And I guess we think that is such a parsimonious explanation that surely that has to be at the top of the tree of explanations before we resort to prediction.
Much more parsimonious than a Bayesian system, like free energy principle, I suppose. Yeah, that's what's.
Yeah, but that's not to say that some people working in the free energy area aren't aware of these dilemmas and can't talk their way around them. And it's also not to say that we don't predict, because we can predict, especially human beings can make predictions. But what I would argue is that the default operation of our nervous system is not to need to predict, it's to control. But as and when we definitely do need to predict, we will make that attempt, and we can do mental simulation examples. So prediction does happen, but it's not, you know, and I guess what jars with me about free energy principle is it's trying to propose that
We've lost you there, Warren. I don't know if you can
this
hear me.
organisation of matter
Sorry,
predicts.
we lost you there.
Yeah, that's not necessary. Yeah, I'd say that term prediction is unnecessary for a lot of what humans and other animals do.
Warren, I'm so sorry we lost you there for a second.
Right. Okay.
Could you start? I think you were beginning to offer a sort of a critique of the free energy principle, or at least discuss the limitations.
Okay. Well, I think I'd already provided some of that, but I was basically saying that, having explained the flyball model, I was explaining that that's essentially our default way of controlling all the multiple skills that we have, language and kind of dance and a lot of sophisticated things that we do, and that we don't need to necessarily build into make predictions.
Right? Is it because from an evolutionary point of view, the simplest or the least restrictive or the least the least resistive path would be controlled rather than a predictive model or a complex computation?
Yeah, you want to be able to be an agency to create your own future, not, you know, spend huge amounts of computational power predicting multiple futures that may or may not happen.
The question then would be,
that's part of the reason.
The question then would be, would FEP provide any more advantage over a PCT for survival?
I think personally, I think that only when it comes to trying to understand the origin of life.
Right.
But I think they will have to stick to the maths and try and steer away from some of the reifying language that they use.
And there was a very nice example that you gave in a different video, Warren, about predator and prey. And I think you'd started to test that empirically, whereby if prey are moving in an unpredictable manner, there's something more going on there other than the fact that it's. I've explained that terribly. I'll let you explain. I'll let you.
Well, I'm not sure what point you're trying to say.
You did a test with a kind of, I think it was with a laser, and you had a kind of, and it demonstrated that there was something else happening other than whether the behavior of the prey was predictable or not. There was something else going on when they were allowed to move freely.
Yeah. I mean, the behavior of what these actual people did with the devices simulating predator and prey was better explained by a very simple process of, in the prey, trying to maximize distance from the predator, and in the predator trying to minimize distance to the prey, and that explanation kind of accounted for the data that we saw better than there being any particular predictions that were made. And actually, this idea that prey just move in a random direction, that seems to occur only at very close distances in certain scenarios. If you look at the research data, actually most of the time they're just trying to keep as far away as possible, using whatever action will keep them that distance. There's some trying to rob food off each other, who in Canada have researched.
Can I use this as an opportunity to ask, you very kindly sent me a chapter on this and I haven't read it yet, but how does this fit in with a kind of an enactive viewpoint, embodied cognition, life-mind continuity thesis? Do you see PCT as something to be complementary? Do you see it as a kind of rival, if you like, theory? I
mean, I probably don't know enough about how those terms are operationally defined, but clearly PCT is immediately in an enactive and an embodied theory, but it's not because it's trying to be, it just is. But it's also one that specifies principles that don't fall out from an attempt to take an enactive or an embodied agenda, you know. So the core issue with conflict comes from understanding control. It doesn't come from it being inactive. So yes, it is enactive and embodied, but I don't think that is the clue to understand these principles of life that we need to understand to help each other and to kind of understand development.
So perhaps an active cognition would benefit from PCT, but perhaps not vice versa.
Yeah, potentially. I like to have an open mind. Like I say, there is this interface between kind of logic and analog processing that I think PCT could learn from. It has been described in the theory, but I think we could look again at, you know, the data that's coming out to kind of reconceptualize that. And I guess that is an issue within the enactive and embodied community, isn't it? How much you can explain something just through kind of the logical explanation rather than the experiential sensomotor kind of system. But within PCT, I mean, Bill Powers, right at the start, PCT did delineate between those two different types of control perceptions, ones that are continuous, analog, sensomotor, experiential, and ones that are categorical, logical, and sequential. He chose to position them, the kind of logical, symbolic ones, intermediate in the hierarchy, with abstract principles and system concepts above them. And I'm unsure whether that's the best place to put them or not. But yeah, it is fascinating. Some of you will know about a theory called TOTE, test operate, test exit. That's a cybernetic theory that was developed in 1960, the same time as PCT. That kind of occupies just one element of the hierarchy within PCT. So, you know, PCT theory encompasses, you know, depending on the perceptual level that we're describing, it lends itself to different fields. Oh, sorry about any instabilities there. Okay. Oh, you're muted.
I'm aware we've run over ever so slightly. I'd just like to give anyone else an opportunity who hasn't, you know, who would like to ask a question before we.
I'd just like to thank Dr. Mansell, because I'm a clinician, and but I think his explanation of this theory and all of these principles made sense to me in a way that I can't articulate because I don't know enough to be able to speak. But it just, as a clinician, seem to connect up, and I was just trying to find parallels with sitting in a room with somebody.
If it helps at all, Bill Power's wife was a Rogerian person-centered counsellor.
Okay.
And Carl Rogers wrote a sort of glowing endorsement of this theory.
Oh, well, that's helpful, because I was thinking of just the common factors in psychotherapy about just staying out of the way, basically, and being non-judgmental and encouraging and warm. And for me, I mean, in a very simple way, what you're saying, it seems to connect up with that, really, and that our judgment about what's good for somebody else is not really the point at all. I think to explain something so complicated that it seems to me, it's just a tribute, really, because I was, able to, even in this short time, make the connection with sitting in the room with somebody. So thank you.
No worries. And practicing the therapy, method levels, is not complicated at all, which is nice. It's
well, that's what it seemed to me. It is parsimonious and simple, and a bit like CAT, the therapy David and I are involved in.
All right.
Isn't that right, David? Would you agree with that?
Yes. And I suppose it would be a worry in a way, wouldn't it, if what you're saying didn't fit clinical practice somehow or other. It has to fit in to lend it credibility, and vice versa, isn't it? It does make sense. Yeah.
But it's sometimes people find it hard to let go of the attempts as a clinician to interpret and formulate and start to suggest things for the clients. But we find majority of clients kind of are enabled by that, like you're saying, getting out of the way, as it were, and helping people to explore with your curiosity, scaffolding that.
These are all good CAT words. There's cognitive analytic therapy about scaffolding and collaboration and open-endedness and so thank you.
All right.
I would love to ask you a million more questions, Warren, but I think I better do my job as chair and finish up there. And I suppose I'd just like to echo what Leonie said, and just thank you so much. That was a really fascinating talk, as I knew it would be, but you explained a very complex subject matter very eloquently, and it's much appreciated.
Chris, I thought Ian had a question.
Oh, sorry, Ian.
I saw Ian lifting his hand up. So
my kind of question always, when it comes to diagnostic practice, I think we still live in the world of Emil Kraepelin, who divided functional psychosis into schizophrenia and manic depression. And for Kraepelin, the big thing was the ability to prognosticate. And I don't know if we've moved further on from that, but I mean, does your system totally stay away from the ability to predict the future? There may have been a bit of discussion there, but the traditional view of functional psychoses is that certain symptoms, certain psychopathology equals a poor prognosis versus, the chance of recovery is more with mood disorders. Does it have anything to say about?
Well, it does have something very strong to say, but it's really just to say that individual differences will transcend those kind of categorical predictions, and that we need to have an open mind as to how an individual's life will unfold as they reorganize, as they make new attempts to try and control what matters to them. So, that's it in an essence. I mean, what I can share with you briefly is a diagram I put together to try and illustrate how I think we're in this position where we're diagnosing people. What I think is going on is, we have at the bottom here some shared concerns across all of us, and this is the general population here that we all share with each other. We want to feel good about ourselves and control about our lives. But each of us have certain aspects, certain goals that we overvalue compared to others, whether it be weight and shape, cleanliness, creativity, safety from attack, whatever. And there'll be both biological and cultural and learning reasons why we end up overvaluing some concerns over others. But clearly they create quite a tapestry of different concerns. And what I would argue is that you could categorize all of us on that basis. But we probably wouldn't be quite as easy to categorize as people who go over this cutoff point at the top. And they're the people where those overvalued goals and concerns and conflicts between them have got so strong that the person has lost control over their lives and they're coming to us for treatment. Mm-hmm. And that makes it a little bit easier to identify those different concerns. So what's happening is our diagnostic system is an artifact of the fact that there are those same individual differences on a much more subtle level across the general population. But they're not the core mechanism of psychopathology. The core mechanism of psychopathology is not resolving chronic goal conflict, keeping those higher level systems out of awareness for all kinds of reasons. It's just not practical half the time to go that deep. And so it's that fundamental process that we need to access through a more universal therapy like method levels to anyone who wants it, without getting stuck in triaging people to specific elements.
I mean, that's very interesting. The one I would be skeptical about is psychotic disorder, because I mean, traditionally it's viewed as a discontinuity. I would find it very hard to imagine myself into the mind of somebody with schizophrenia.
No, it's not. There is, unfortunately, there is a lot of evidence for paranoid beliefs being expressed by people in the general population, hearing voices being expressed by people in the general population. To take some examples.
I mean, 19th century psychiatrists called themselves alienists because the alienation of mind wasn't something readily understood. But I think that this is an eternal debate that I'm also a skeptic for unifying theories in general, but that would be a long discussion.
Why, do you mean you don't believe in Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection? That's a unifying.
I do.
Well, it's just the same. PCT is just the same as natural selection, but over a much faster timescale within the brain.
I'll buy into that. Yeah, I'll buy into that. But, of course, natural selection isn't necessarily progress. So it's it's highly variable what it does. Yeah.
I think we better leave it there. I'm so desperate to ask you more questions, Warren, but I'll maybe drop you some via an email. So once again, thank you so much for a really fascinating talk, and I'll put some links on the YouTube video so people can access more of your work. So thank you very much.
Yeah, certainly not just my work, and what we're talking about here really touches on the work by a chap called Gary Ziko, Cziko. He's written 2 fascinating books that are about universal theory, cutting across PCT and evolution.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.